to Nature 8, and we're 2/3 of the way through our first phase, and we're trying to appreciate and understand how learning is possible and how to do it and how to bring that learning back into circulation in our lives so that they improve, and not just by little increments, but all across the board dramatically. And it can be done. One of the biggest difficulties, though, is appreciating that nature does not exist. It's not non-existent either, but occurs as a continuum. But our ideas about a continuum are all from math and physics, and they are all concerned with number, with numerals, with sequences, and even such a great volume as The Continuum by Hermann Weyl is all about the ongoing numerical continuum that is the field of materia which mathematics deals with. But we're talking about something that is one phase before that. Our continuum is nature and does not record at all in any way as an objectivity. This is very, very difficult initially to address and to come to. One of the most interesting ways to express it. In 1969 in Berkeley, when the young Chogyam Trungpa came to give his first American lecture, the Tibetan Lama who eventually became the founder of the Naropa Institute and author of many, many books. And at this time, he was just a very young man, fresh from an auto accident and from a year or two in Britain, and he still walked with a cane at that time, and came out with a plaid flannel shirt and a big liter of Coke in one hand and a cigarette in the other. And you thought, a Lama? But when he sat to talk and began talking, you realized the flow of clarity was unbroken. His diction and his language in its grammar and syntactic wholeness was flawless. This is a very distinguishing tone. It's not the tone of a storyteller who tells of experiences, but it's the tone of someone who has mastered nature. And so experience is often called dharma because it is true, and it has laws, and it has, in its process, ways to understand it. But nature is the high dharma. There's no way to put an understanding form on nature. And so it has a very peculiar paradoxical quality. At one point in some of his early lectures, Chogyam Trungpa recalled how he was assigned to his root guru, Jamyang, would sit in this hut off away from all the other huts and all the other dorms and all the other buildings and from the temple. And this hut had no window, and it was all dark except for just some slats of light that would seep in between the boards, and he would sit there. And Jamgon Kongtrul, with the 8-year-old Chogyam Trungpa, teaching him, And he would give him various projects to do, various mudras to perform, various insights and yogas. And finally, he asked him, he said, do you enjoy this? And Trungpa said he was overcome, that no one ever mentioned that you would enjoy it. And his root guru then said, well, when you do such and so, what happens? And his reply was, well, nothing happens. And the root guru said, that's wonderful. Now don't tell anyone. And he said, here I was at age 9, coming away down the path from the hut, wondering what not to tell. Usually, an individual will be founded on their character, which is a figure in experience, and so there will be a swirl of circumstance. But a reincarnated Rinpoche has already transcended the swirl of experience, has colored outside the character, and so being in the high Dharma, there are non-moments of no mind where it just occurs naturally and doesn't record. The most famous sequence in Zen Buddhism is a sequence of drawings done by Takuan, who was a Zen master and who was also a very good artist. And he did a sequence of 10 pictures, a set of 10 pictures. They're called, in traditional Zen lore, the 10 bulls. And in Takuan, the first picture is the character in the village drinking with the butchers and just there in the village life. And then he begins to sense that there is a bull to tame in his nature. And as he goes through, the illustrations show the progress in sequence of how one discovers oneself. Finding the bull, taming the bull, riding the bull. But the 9th picture is blank. And the traditional ascription to this is both bull and self transcended. And then the 10th picture, very similar to the first. He's back in the village drinking with the butchers. But there's a difference. The difference is now that one has added clarity to the spectrum of events. And so everything that occurs is ratioed by clarity. This is only real because nature is a continuum. Not a continuum of counting, but a continuum of zero. And because it is a continuum of zero, it is as well, in the exercise of any logic, infinite. That zero and infinity operate seamless is a logical fact. When they come into play in any kind of proportion, any kind of ratioing, then the one that occurs is distinct. Otherwise, unity would just be a blur. And because nature as continuum is both zero and infinite, it is both empty and full at the same time. It is both shunyata and pleroma at the same time, and allows for whatever emerges to be discretely real and unified in and on and of and with itself, And because each discretion quanta has this shared capacity, it is possible to have relationalities between unities. And because there's relationality, that is a character of unity. Proportions hold, ratios hold, groups hold, sets hold, phases hold, harmonics hold, and we have the possibility for understanding on very, very precise, exact, high, penetrating levels. And so our education is aiming to recycle our learning so that we constantly now at this first phase in nature are aware that some of the most important qualities occur because something that is not apparent is also happening but not registering. The deepest learning is unlearning at the same time as exploring the unknown. And when both those happen together in the same set as a pair, the pairedness of that is what is effective as the dynamic of education. Not only the dynamic of education, but the dynamic of all evolution, the dynamic of the way in which the exactness of registry, of particles, of waves, of bacteria, of viruses, of cells, of animals, of people, of characters, that all of that occurs in reality and has at its root, the root of emergence itself, each and every iteration, the ability to not only be what it is discretely, but to be relational at the same time. Without this quality, nothing would be able to be real. So that there is a paradox. Unity, at the same time, is a pair. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says, in his inimitable poetic, mystic way, the Tao cannot be talked about at all. But what can be talked about at its deepest is paired. But the pair is not two, the pair is one. And its pair mate is zero. So that one is always discrete because zero is not discrete and is related to it. So that one can be always then stated as 1 over 1, and it is true. And the ratio, the proportion of 1 over 1 is a unity, though now in its expression it is a pair moderated by a relational sign. And so when one looks at the ratioing of pairedness in expression, it's actually a 3. It's actually 3 elements that occur together, the 2 ones and the relationality. So that the deepest real logic is that if one can count 1, 2, 3, you must precede that with 0, or you must allow the 1, 2, 3 to have an ellipsis and go to infinity. This is the correct way of speaking. And of course, one of the great books by super mathematician George Gamow is entitled 1, 2, 3, ellipsis, infinity. Our education is 0, 1, 2, 3, and that square of 0, 1, 2, 3 is the first year, is the first integral cycle, is the whole ecology of how things come together. And yet, it is complemented by a reverse field where they not only come together, but they are expressively differential and go out not into further coming together, but go out into a further array of possibility. So that boundedness is discretely real, though it can be very large, and unboundedness is real but differentially open. Now this is very, very difficult initially to comport to, because all of our background that has a cultural base is necessarily obviating our ability to flow in this way. And yet it's necessary for culture to obviate that, otherwise it would not have the ability to believe in its small sets, its locality, its provincialness. And while all of that tribal quality, all of that group quality is necessary in experience on that level, one needs to speak of it in the sense that there are further developments, and one of the further developments from culture is the development of thought, of symbols. And we'll see that the development of the symbolic mind, while it completes the ecology of integration in nature, because nature mysteriously, as a continuum, is not contained within the integral ecology, it is able to go further in every dimension possible. This is what allows for consciousness to be real. Otherwise, consciousness would not only not be real, it would not be possible. So we're beginning here in nature to take 3 sets of 4. We took the first set of 4 of looking at the I Ching and Thoreau to try to get a sense of thousands of years of comporting to nature. And now we've taken Jane Goodall and Mary Leakey going back millions of years. And our next set is going to be Lynn Margulis and James D. Watson. Margulis, a professor for many decades at Amherst University in Amherst, Massachusetts, author of about 30 books. Her book, Symbiotic Planet, that all life is, by nature, symbiotic. It is paradness, it is relatable, it is relational, and is quite real because of it, and capable of transforms because of it. And of course, Watson's great double helix, the realization that the complementarity in the deepest paradness is not so much that it is parallel, both running the same way, but it's parallel because one goes one way and one goes the other. That if the 2 strands of the double helix didn't go each other's way, then the possibility for the infinite array of transformability for life would not be established. There would be a liminal that eventually would be reached. The fact is, life is infinitely possible in unconceivable realms of variety and freedom, and that this is true. We're coming to the 4th of the presentations with Mary Leakey and Jane Goodall, and the relational bar that holds Jane Goodall and Mary Leakey together was Louis Leakey, LSB Leakey. Louis, who was the husband of Mary Leakey and who was the mentor, who was the foster father to Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall's natural father was a race car driver, one of the world's greatest race car drivers. The Le Mans is one of the most grueling races in the world, and he's one of the few human beings to ever compete in it 10 years in a row. A giant of a race car driver. But race car drivers live in a world of machines and centrifugal force. One of the qualities that's there in a good race car driver, once Sterling Moss was interviewed, he said, "What's the most important thing when you're in that?" He said, "To drive by the seat of your pants." You have to be sat in your saddle in order to deal with the world of machines and centripetal force. But in the high Dharma, it's important not to be afraid to ride bareback without a saddle. So that the widest open yoga in the Vajrayana is called Lam Rim. It literally means bareback without a saddle. It means living in the zeroness of nature and in the infinity of consciousness without bothering that they are wide open forever, and that in no way obviates that what you are doing will have efficacy and the relationalities will be as real as any unity, and that the pairedness can be extended, one would say mathematically, exponentially. You can not only have two, but you can have two squared, you can have two cubed, and so on. And the squares and cubes will be resonant realities related in that set. In fact, when the nature of number was first understood by Pythagoras, the first expression of it in classical Greek culture is in Plato's Timaeus, and he gives the famous lambda where the squares and the cubes, 2, 4, 8, 3, 9, 27, that they meet together. They do not meet together just at 1, but they meet together in a 1 which has emerged in such a way that it's not statically there, but is iteratively vibrational. So that the further developments of exponential powers are real in the sense that they also are further iterations. They're not just multiplications of the 1, but they're emergences in themselves from the 0 as well. And that this is extremely difficult to appreciate at first, but once one gets it, you never again will be totally ignorant. It is a quality which Louis Leakey learned not from his father or from his mother. Canon Leakey was a missionary sent to Kenya very early on, and Louis was born 1903, and it was a situation where he was the only white child in his childhood. And so when he was 17, he looked like a Kikuyu warrior, because he was. The language he dreamed in was Kikuyu, not English. He was an African and not a European. He says in his book on the Mau Mau and the Kikuyu, published in London in 1952, at this time in Kenya and British East Africa, the Mau Mau uprising was just terrorizing everything, much like the Islamic fundamentalists of bin Laden and so forth in the world today. Very, very similar time, very, very similar circumstance. And Louis Leakey was the only white man who could go and talk personally to Jomo Kenyatta. Kenyatta means the man of the great mountain, Mount Kenya. That he was the man of the land, and spoke not as a revolutionary, but he spoke as the voice of the landscape, and that the people were the children of the earth landscape mother. And so he was the spokesman for the children of the earth, of that earth there. And Lewis went to visit him and was instrumental in penetrating through the Mau Mau terrorist syndrome and bringing out of it a very interesting high order. He says at the end of his book on the Mau Mau, Kikuyu country as it is today is vastly different from what it was in my boyhood days. Then every Kikuyu lived in an old-style hut. Now there are hundreds of good stone houses, thousands of good, clean, semi-permanent wattle and daub houses with windows and decent furniture. And although there are still hundreds of thousands of old-style, unhygienic huts, these are disappearing faster and faster. This is 1952. When I was a boy, there was not a single shop in Kikuyu country. Now there are hundreds of well-built stone shops owned by Kikuyu merchants where the housewife and the peasant farmer can buy soap, clothes, blankets, foodstuffs, various medicines such as aspirin and other things they need. When I was young, most Kikuyu were still dressed in old-style native leather clothes, with a few wearing blankets or dirty pieces of cotton cloth over their shoulders. Today, throughout Kikuyu country, there are Kikuyu tailors with sewing machines of their own, cutting out and making dresses, shirts, trousers, shorts for their innumerable customers. No motor vehicle existed when I was a boy for white or black, and now thousands of Kikuyu own lorries, buses, cars, motorcycles, and the sight of a camera in the hands of a European trying to get a picture of the savages to send his family at home often caused consternation. Today there are many Kikuyu with cameras of their own and very few Kikuyu houses without wedding pictures and family photos and of the latest baby hung on the wall. And he says, it is not the change that has caused the terrorist uprising, but it's the rapidity and the speed that outdistant made the inarticulation of change fearful, and that one of the most deepest understandings is that one has to speed up the ability to go through the rapidly evolving iteration of events and things, and the fear evaporates. The fearfulness is a byproduct of being inarticulately squeezed and pressurized in one's experience, and that without a deep, not contact with nature, but without a deep participation in nature as continuum, there's no way to vary the pace of experience vis-a-vis the local culture. You can have, and do have, a local culture in every little English village, as in every little African village, every little Indian village, every little chimpanzee group, and chimpanzees from different parts of Africa have different cultures. Different, not so much culture, but different socialities. So that there needs to be, in persons like ourselves, an ability to change speeds of experience so as to be able to calibrate and live naturally, no matter how fast the change occurs or how deeply transforming a change would be. And this is an education, and it takes a while, it takes the patience to learn how to do that, and that's what we're attempting to learn. When Jane Goodall realized how difficult the world really was, and that her chimpanzee community at Gombe Stream was getting more and more squeezed by the pressures of the landscape being denuded, decimated. She said in one of her videos that riding on a boat coming back to Gombe Stream, and she said there was a time when all the way from Kigoma, many, many dozens of miles down the coast, all the way to Gombe Stream was unbroken forest and as far as one could go on Lake Tanganyika. And just in her 30 years there, all of the hills are denuded. There are no trees. There's no forage. And Gombe Stream Preserve is like a little park in a decimated landscape. And of course the chimps, in the meantime, in that condensation, felt that pressure, and out of that pressure came tremendous oddities like warfare among groups of chimps, like cannibalism of one of the mothers and her daughter trying to find any infant that they could to eat them. That all kinds of very peculiar distortions happen because of not just social pressures, but because of the inarticulation of experience itself, not having access to flow with nature. So that it is very interesting. She became so depressed that she retreated from any contact except just a few minimal things for 10 years. And she devoted herself in this monastic, ascetic, disgusted retreat from the world. She devoted herself to 10 years of writing maybe one of the greatest zoological documents of all time. It's called The Chimpanzees of Gombe, Patterns of Behavior, published by Harvard University Press. And in the Chimpanzees of Gombe, one has for the very first time an understanding of the incredible similarities and likenesses of the great primates to man. In fact, one of the volumes that was published later by Harvard is called What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee, on apes, people, and their genes. That people are 98% chimpanzee. The dedication: for my mother Van, for the chimpanzees of Gombe themselves, and in memory of Louis Leakey. Because it was definitely Louis Leakey who brought into play the ability to return to nature for real and allow for experience to flow with it for real, long enough and deep enough so that it became magnetic and he could pass that on to others. One of the others that he passed it on to was Mary Leakey. Another that he passed it on to was Jane Goodall. Less successful, he tried to pass it on to Diane Fossey and to Birute Gilkes. His whole emphasis was that all the great apes should be studied, the orangutans, the gorillas, and the chimpanzees. And of the 3 young women that he arranged and sent out to go and study them as a correlation of his whole life's work, it was Jane Goodall, who proved to be the fruitful carrier. And just as Louis Leakey, towards the last decade that he was alive, began lecturing all over the world, it is Jane Goodall who has carried that on. She lectures all over the world all the time. She says of her life now, I never spend more than 2 or 3 weeks in one place. And she travels the whole planet all the time, the whole sphere, the whole globe, all the time, ceaselessly, not to repeat, but to iterate and bring the vibration of the planet into that quality of being at home in nature as a continuum. It's a very difficult thing to do. And she learned it from Louis Leakey. And he learned it because he was an African. And to him, the middle relational between the land and the tribe were the animals. And so for him, animals were always that relational line where the two ones become one, become a unity. When one is able to be with the land in a oneness, and one is able to be relational through the animals, then one's experience of oneself is a unity. Not a unity apart from the land, but a unity with the land, because the relational through the animals is a seamless part of that, and that's how it becomes a continuum again. Re-emerges real without break. Jane Goodall learned to do this with chimpanzees and then extended it to other animals like hyenas, and then finally extended it to human beings. And is trying to teach that all over the planet now, that if we can use ourselves with all the resonant gradations of all of our evolution, all animal life, back all plant life, if we can use all of the instances of life as our relational, then the entire planet will be one, and we ourselves will be one in such a way that those unities do not obviate each other, but concourse together. The proviso in this education is that we're taking it many levels beyond that. One planet is not enough. One star system is not enough. One galaxy is not enough. The universe is our home. And in that landscape, our unity is also possible to occur as a presence. But the relationality is not just all life, but all reality in whatever iteration, whatever quanta occur. All the particles, all the waves, all the protons, all the mesons, all of it, all the neutrinos, to be able to be at home in the neutrino blizzard and not be cold in any dimension. This is the learning that we're pursuing. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back to Louis Leakey. The National Geographic Society published his book on animals of East Africa. But it was published several years after they published Jane Goodall's My Friends the Wild Chimpanzees. They published her first, even though they had funded him longer, and he was the father. But Louis Leakey is extremely difficult to appreciate and understand, because he was not at all, even that he was not European but African, but he had gone back beyond our species. This is very difficult to appreciate, and it sounds mysterious, and it is. We were talking about how unity can be expressed as one over one, and then the line, the relational line between them, is a third part of the expression. Of how nature occurs as a set of zero infinity in that set of 0 infinity, there is a ratio relational occurrence of the ellipses. So that strategic pauses, while they are not a part of the form, nor are they a part of the process, yet they are mysterious in setting up the cadence of articulation. So that a magician who does his parlor magic, his legerdemain, will use a certain staccato of movement, and you will not see any movement at all, and yet the movement will have occurred, will be there. Nature is like that. Is a process as a continuum where change occurs not all the time, but before time occurs. So that time has its iterative qualities no matter what scale one works with it, by the year, by the week, by the nanosecond, by the aeon. All of the calibrations then of time that we would wish to measure it by, to keep track of it by, have actuality because of this situation, because of this condition. And just so, pauses in time are likewise real. The lover knows this, the mystic knows this, the poet knows this. The primordial person who is native in nature knows this. So that those are non-occurring spaces that are a part of the ratios of the real. How they translate into actuality, into life, is because they are given an event seed. Let me give you a personal story. Some of you have come for a long time, have heard some versions of this, just to convey the sense of what this is. When I was 19 and 21 years old, I was the head porter at Sequoia National Park in the Sierras. And one evening, in the dark, when I got off work, it was always about 11 o'clock at night, which in the Sierras in the early 60s was really dark. And I used to sometimes go down a mile or so of the General's Highway, the only road, and go to the back of the coffee shop and get something to eat. They would always favor me, let me eat, and then I would walk back about midnight. And one time I took a shortcut through the forest to cut the distance down back to where the cabins were and the lodge and so forth. And walking through this dark forested area, I bumped into a bear, ran right into her. And immediately started backing away in a very interesting kind of movement. And I had my flashlight on my belt, and I shined the light straight. And when bears are angry, they do not growl, they hiss. And she was ready to come after me. We were contiguous. And fortunately, my movement back was in the right cadence. She forgave me as an animal forgives, that it was just an accident and not a threat at all, and I was able to live. Carrying that movement into meditation later, because in those days I meditated all the time, I saw that it was the certain staccato movement, and also that the distance was occurring in such a way that there was no fear there, nor was there aggression, but there was simply the occurrence that happens in nature. It was what happened, and that was it. But seeing in deeper meditation that there is a cadence to movement, what was the seed of my being able to move in that way that that bear understood? And asking that and concentrating on that, it finally came that this had happened when I was about 10. I was always as a premature child, I was always bronchial and asthmatic, and I could never play like other boys, never go out. And by the time I got healthy at age 9, I was able finally to ask and was sent to a YMCA camp to camp out. And one of the things that they did is they took you on a hike so that you would set up tents one night and then come back. You went about 8 or 10 blocks from camp. And every boy took a half tent. And when we got there and set them up, there were 7.5 tents. And I, being the smallest boy, of course, was put in the half tent. And sure enough, at night, a bear came into camp, walking by, and walked so close to my open half tent that I could smell him, and I was convinced he was going to eat me. And I gave up. I thought, there's nothing I can do. And the bear snuffled by close enough that I could just feel the fur. And the fact that I was just there with that bear at that event saved my hide some 9 years later, running into that bear. Because I was able to be instantly bearness. Not bear-like, but bearness. And learned that summer reading things like the Odyssey and Beowulf, and that there was a theme in all of these called the bear son. Beowulf is the bear son. Odysseus is the bear son. That one is kin to a totem animals to the extent that one is of that family. One is of that kind. And they will not hurt you. But it occurred to me that bear was not my totem at all. And I thought, because I was able to move, in those days, quite agile, I thought perhaps it's the deer. And practiced not only watching deer, but being deerness. Not just deer-like, but deerness. And learned to move through the forest at full pace, running full blast, and not hitting any trees and not tripping. And became quite good at it. I could even do it at night in moonlight. But it wasn't, for me, that the bear or the deer or even the animal realm was the totem on really finally deep meditation. The totem for me were the giant sequoias. I was a giant sequoia tree. Ness. There I was at home. So that the landscape of the giant forest itself was nature as a continuum for me, and I understood that. So when I come to understanding Louis Leakey and how he was a part of Africa, he was Africa. But he went deeper than Africa. He went back beyond our species in Africa to the Old Stone Age. He went back to the Paleolithic Africa. And that was where his totem was. And because there were no Paleolithic persons alive from hundreds of thousands of years ago, or now we know it's millions of years ago, but what was there of them were their stone tools. The Paleolithic means the Old Stone Age. And so Louis Leakey learned, he was the first man, probably in 500,000 years, who learned from scratch how to make beautiful stone tools. He could make the choppers, he could make the spearheads, he could make the arrowheads, he could make the scrapers. One of the implements that he originated, because paleontology and archaeology all have to have measurable intervals that are universal, and he used to use a nail that was about 4 inches long, so many centimeters long. And that this nail then, when it was put into a little block of wood, was the awl which the diggers would use, and they would only go in as far as the nail's length, and so that became the calibration. The 4 inches became the calibration for the levels of a dig. And that the squares made then by multiples of that were what were fenced off with strings, so that you could tell where you were in a stratigraphy and where you were in a particular site. And that all of this calibration was the handheld nail awl that was his version of a tool, a tuned tool, calibratable, measurable. So that Louis Leakey used stone tools as the median relating his unity as a man back to the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers in their unity, and established a synergy, established a ratio of the real, and literally became a living example of Paleolithic life alive in our own time, and was able to teach this to others. And the first person to learn it from him was his wife, Mary Leakey, because she was already tuned to Paleolithic art. She could understand, even from girlhood, the artists of 40,000 years ago. But she learned through Louis to go back even deeper, back into the land, back, so that she became calibrated also to millions of years. Louis deepened. He was able to calibrate Jane Goodall back to tens of millions of years, back to 70, 80 millions of years. And Jane Goodall was able to be with the chimpanzees at Gombe Stream, not being there looking at them, but being chimpanzee herself. Which is why they got over their fear of her, because she was no longer different from them in the iteration of her being. Because we are not just statically there, we are constantly reoccurring. Every cell, every atom, every molecule is constantly reoccurring in its iteration and has a certain set. In the life cycle of a whole pattern of DNA, it is the ends that the telomeres that gauge how long that set will be able to reiterate and occur. And as one ages, the telomeres become shorter and shorter, and eventually death is there as a natural part of the end of that cycle, because they are used up. They're gone. It's possible to extend them now, and it is possible to live a very long time coming up. But the whole purpose is not to become immortal, that you refuse to die, but to participate in the mysteriousness of nature, that it reiterates in such a way that there is a unity of a ratio of the real that reoccurs despite that one part of that expression has gone through its iterative set and now dies because it has given that up to the expression of it, but that doesn't mean that it is obviated from the real, but can reoccur. Can reoccur world without end. This is a very, very deep quality, and it was difficult for Louis Leakey because he was a pioneer for the very first time, and because his own father was a minister, missionary, who had come from the great British Christian civilization of the British Empire to Christianize the savages of Africa. And because Louis Leakey grew deeper and deeper, he realized that it was his father's world that was the savage world. It was the Africans who were real in their nature. And yet he deepened because he had this capacity to deepen, and if you keep at it a long time. Gandhi once said of himself, he said, I'm just a average person who just never gave up, and after 78 years I've become a social yogi on world scale. The continuity of application builds, in yoga it's called tapas. And it's not that you have earned something. The whole idea of merit is a misnomer. And so the high Dharma gets around that by saying, whatever merit I have earned, I give to others. In the old way, the Theravada, it's called the metta, and it's a prayer of giving away anything that you have earned of merit in the universe. And you give it away not to someone, but freely. And you don't know who received it, and they don't know who gave it. And so it fulfills Maimonides, the highest criteria of charity. No one knows who gave, and no one knows who received, and yet the gifting occurred. This is very deep. In Sanskrit, the word for that is dana. And dana is the seed out of which prajna, wisdom, flourishes. And by giving one act of dana any time ever in your life, your ability for universal wisdom is assured. However long it takes is up to your ability to modulate your actions so that they transform out of karma into the cadence of articulation, where the wholeness of the whole occurs with you at every iteration. It's actually a problem in engineering and not a problem in hoping. One can do this, but one has to sidestep the addiction to the electrocuting, holding on to the old inarticulate sequencing, which has no space of zeros or infinities at all, no ellipses of pause in the pell-mell scrunching. And Aldous Huxley, in the Perennial Philosophy, said, the mystic swims in the very water that the neurotic drowns. It's a matter of learning how to swim in reality rather than drowning, because you refuse to learn the cadence of swimming. For Louis Leakey, because of his father's world being so dominant, because of his African world being so completely inside out and topsy-turvy, because of that conundrum being deepened and expanded to the Paleolithic, His big concern, one of his earliest books, is called Adam's Ancestors. The problem was that Adam is, okay, the first man in your church doctrine had ancestors. Nothing is made like that. That would be a cheap parlor trick. God doesn't put on cheap parlor shows. Puts on something called the universe. Big. Real big. They show him making stone tools here. They show him holding bones. They show him with the calibrations that he learned, the tools, the stone tools, and the fossil bones. He learned to coordinate them. And in fact, it's interesting because the paper edition of Adam's Ancestors that was published from the fourth edition, Adam's Ancestors, appeared in 1934. And by the third edition, in paperback, the title page shows all the stone tools. Adam's ancestors were the bones, made the tools. The tools are the differential expression of Paleolithic man. The bones are the natural integral of Paleolithic man. If you put the set of the bones and the set of the tools into cross-referencing, you begin to get the fabric of what was possible if only you could understand the context in which that fabric occurred, which is the landscape. So that one had to study the bones, the tools, and the geology. And a part of the geology is that the geological indexing is so vast, hundreds of millions of years. Precambrian rocks are 500 million years old. You have to have a calibration, a sub-calibration within the geology, and that's the animals. The animals and the plants. If you know the geology, and you know the animals and the plants, and the bones and the tools, and you work all this together, it's not just juggling something, but what occurs out of it increasingly, out of these materials, is a vision of the ratio of the real. And it was possible, even in an age of sirens and crises and emergencies, to sink deep enough into seeing the vision that the consciousness of that vision, the creative imagination of that vision, could come back and exchange places with the memory in the mind. Possible because memory initially emerges as consciousness. But when that consciousness goes into the mind, it's like a seed totem for the mind now to have memory, which it didn't have before. It could integrate. It could integrate representations, images, into skeins of images that are now an idea of some imagined wholeness, but it couldn't remember until it was able to do that do-si-do and have an exchange. So that when one has that creative vision to that extent, one is able to not only see visionarily, but is able to go back into the mind and remember precisely. It's not just a matter of remembering past lives. It's a matter of remembering the exactness to any degree of specificity of what occurs. This can be done. We need this scale of learning because the pace of change now is not just that of 1920. The pace of 2020 is going to be about 10,000 times as fast as 1920. But that is not something daunting. It is simply an extending of the facility for articulation, which we already have. In fact, all of his work was to show, here's one of his later books called Adam or Ape. He was working on it when he was dying of complications of a severe heart attack. No longer Adam's ancestors, Adam or Ape. And the blurb says, from Darwin until the most recent discoveries, the study of evolution, as Adam or Ape clearly shows, is replete with contradictions. In the history of the field, there have been attempts to suppress theories. In the history of evolution, some misleading fossil discoveries have been proven to be forgeries. Even today, the details of evolution still surrounded with veils of contradiction, and hypotheses often confuse us as to the exact evidence about the beginning of man. So that it is essential to know the evidence, but not the evidence in a model of law, not the evidence in a model of argument. It's not evidence in the ordinary sense, but it's evidence in this kind of mystical sense that it is emergent, just now fresh, out of nature, and so one sees it for the very first time with clear eyes. Because it just now emerged at this instant, clearly for the first time. It is fresh, it is new, it is real in that sense, and that's what he had to develop, did develop, taught Mary, taught Jane Goodall, was the ability to go into a natural landscape and to envision millions of years wide and to see that that bit of rock is a tooth and not a stone. That this configuration is a part of a skull and not some kind of a detritus from something recent, but goes back who knows how far. And as he was able to develop this more and more, his articulate work outstripped the social conditions that were around him. He was born into Church of England missionary work with the savages, and he learned that the missionaries were the savages. Then he learned that the modern world is very often the savage world, and that Paleolithic man was not a savage. He was native to the nature that was real then and is still in its continuity real now. It's very difficult, I know, but that's what he learned to do. And he learned to work very comfortably in it and teach it. And one of the things, he was very fortunate because he himself had a guide. His name was W.E. LaGrose Clark, a very tall, distinguished, loving paleontologist in England. And he was one of the first people to understand what was possible and to endorse the young Louis Leakey and to get him going. And eventually, publications like this came out. Here's Volume 1 and Volume 2. This is a series that called Fossil Vertebrates of Africa, Academic Press, New York and London, right at the end of Lewis's life. He did the first 2 volumes. He was working on the third when he became too ill and died. He says in here, April 1969, this is just a year before Volume 2, and Volume 2 was finished just a few weeks before he was incapacitated for 6 months and never really recovered after that. He says in the preface, April 1969, in 1950, arrangements were made with the director of the British Museum of Natural History in London. British Museum, one of the largest venerable institutions in the world, to publish a series of reports under the general title of Fossil Mammals of Africa, 1950. The first number in the series appeared in 1951 and was entitled Miocene Hominidae of East Africa by W.E. LaGrose Clark and L.S.B. Leakey. So he and his mentor, he and his guide, published the first. And then they put out 22 numbers of this, and then the British Museum cut the publication off. He says, in earlier days, the governments of British overseas colonies and territories accepted that all type specimens of new fossil species, as well as a proportion of all other material, should be handed over to what was then the main Commonwealth Museum of Natural History, the British Museum. So anything that was found anywhere in the world, specimen types of that were sent to the British Museum. So it became a repository not just for a lot of books and art, became a repository of millions of bits from all over the planet of every conceivable thing. The difficulty was no one knew how to look at such an enormity with any kind of coherence. It's much like the world today. For most people, it seems incoherent. It's actually rather very simple. This is a very simple planet. There are quadruple planetary systems around quadruple stars that would stagger human beings for the complexity of what just happens just to move. He says, so the British Museum, when it stopped getting things because the colonies became independent, they didn't send things out. They put them into their own museums. And Leakey was one of the first people in Africa to endorse this and founded a museum in Kenya, in Nairobi, and became the director of it. And there, unlike any other place in the world, for the very first time, his ability to envision and to bring back into his mind with memory the kind of exactness he was able to begin to tease out of that the kinds of forms that then went on to establish, and by our time, by 2003, it is a very, very interesting planet where man has been around for at least 5 million years. One of his earliest books is called Stone Age Africa, an outline of prehistory in Africa, and has these beautiful cave paintings, but the really telling publication of his is his first really great book. And this was published by Cambridge University Press, 1931, because L.S.B. Leakey at the time was a fellow of St. John's College in Cambridge, one of the most learned young men in the world. The Stone Age Cultures of Kenya Colony, 1931. And he says in here, discoveries in Kenya prior to 1926, up to the time when the East African Archaeological Expedition started excavations in Kenya in August 1926, no detailed archaeological investigations had been carried out in that colony, although a considerable number of important surface finds had been made, as well as a few discoveries of stone tools in situ. There had been no attempt whatever to work out the cultural sequence, although several people had recognized the existence of several distinct phases. On the other hand, some of the statements made in connection with the discovery of tools in Kenya are astonishing, and the true significance of many of the discoveries had not been realized at all. So that Leakey was the first person to be able to not just go into the field and begin finding things. His first expedition, August 1926. That's when he started. And went all the way until he became incapacitated to work in the field in the late 60s. So he put in over 40 years. Like Moses in the wilderness, only it's Louis Leakey, in the wilderness not of Africa, but in the wilderness of the pre-hominid species that is ourselves. That's a big wilderness. And it was unexplored because it was not even realized that it was possible to be explored. One of the most surprising finds came about 20 miles south of the then city limits of Beijing in China. Now it's in the suburbs of Beijing, which is about 12 million people. There's a hill there, and the hill has some caves, and in one of the caves, a fossil skull was found of not a Homo sapien, not a Homo Neanderthal, but of a human hominid species 500,000 years old. Several species before our species. And that Beijing man used fire as a tool. So that one realized it's not only just the tools and the bones with the plants and the animals and the landscape, but now one had to factor in a transforming factor like fire. And in that transforming, by adding fire to the mix, one now has the beginnings of a magical concoction. It's got effervescence. It has inebriative qualities to it. It's now wine. It can be cognac. So that the whole nature of life now, by 2003, is extraordinary. It's extravagantly fabulous. It was we who were dull. We were the savages. And so with interstellar learning, we're now beginning to open up our eyes and take the blinders off and to see there are aspects of the real beyond belief. We thought that Pluto was the last planet in our star system, and now we know that Pluto is not only a binary, has a moon a third its size, Charon, but that it's a typical specimen of objects in the Kuiper belt that have 100,000 bodies, more than 20% of them binaries, and that they're all larger than 200 kilometers in diameter. Some of them are almost 1,000 miles in diameter. And what else? That there are planets around stars without end. More next week.